Chapter 8. Hypnotism and Mesmerism. Thus far little has been said regarding the light which has been shed upon the subject under consideration by the discoveries of modern science. The more important of these discoveries having resulted from investigations of the subject of hypnotism, it will be necessary briefly to review the more salient features of that science, and to trace its progress from the time of Mesmer down to the present day. Since the time when Mesmer first brought his discoveries to the attention of the scientific world, the students of the phenomena which he evoked have been hopelessly at variance. That they should entertain diverse theories regarding the cause of phenomena so strange and full of mystery is natural. That they should, in the absence of knowledge of the subject, abuse and vilify each other because of their differences of opinion, was to be expected. Hatred of our neighbor because his problematical theories do not agree with our indemonstrable hypotheses is, unfortunately, one of the salient weaknesses of human nature. It is, however, comparatively rare that scientific investigators disagree regarding the demonstrable facts pertaining to a subject under investigation. Yet this is the condition in which we find the science of hypnotism after more than a century of research by some of the ablest scientists of the world. They are divided into schools, today, as they were in the infancy of the science. Indeed, the science is still in its infancy. Facts have accumulated, it is true, and they will be found to be of infinite advantage to some future investigator whose mind is capable of rising above the prejudices which characterize the different schools, and of assimilating and harmonizing their demonstrated facts into one comprehensive system. Thus far the different schools have distrusted or denied each other's facts, and waged war upon each other's theories. The most carefully conducted experiments of one school will, in the hands of the other, produce opposite results. Hence each experimenter is irresistibly led to distrust the scientific accuracy of the methods employed by others, or to admit their integrity only at the expense of their intelligence. In the meantime, each school has conducted its experiments seemingly by the most rigid scientific methods and with conscientious fidelity to truth, but the results of each apparently disprove the conclusions of all the others. Hence it is that, in the bibliography of hypnotism, we find an immense mass of well-authenticated facts which, tried by the standards of any one of the different schools, appears like an appalling hodgepodge of falsehood and delusion, chicanery and superstition. Indeed, no other science, since the dawn of creation, has suffered so much at the hands of ignorance and superstition as the science under discussion. Its ancient history is the record of the supernatural in all the nations of the earth. Its phenomena have been the foundation of all the religions and all the superstitions of ancient times. Its modern history has also been largely a record of superstitious belief, fostered by chicanery and ignorance, the nature of the phenomena being such that in the hands alike of honest ignorance and conscious fraud they may be made to sanction every belief, confirm every dogma, and foster every superstition. It was these facts which drove scientific men from the field of investigation in the early modern history of the science. Mesmer himself, in the light of modern knowledge of the subject, is apt to be accused of charlatanism, but, as we shall see further on, he is entitled, in common with all investigators, to the largest measure of charity. As before remarked, the facts of hypnotism obtained by the experimenters of the different schools appear to contradict each other. This, however, is obviously only an apparent contradiction, for it is axiomatic that no one fact in nature is inconsistent with any other fact. It follows that there must be some underlying principle or principles, heretofore overlooked, which will harmonize the facts. It is the purpose of this chapter to outline a few fundamental principles which, properly understood, will enable the student of hypnotism to reconcile many seeming inconsistencies. An understanding of the salient points of difference between the various schools can best be conveyed by briefly outlining the modern history of the science. Mesmer is entitled to the credit of having first brought the subject to the attention of the scientific world, although probably his attention was attracted to it by the writings of Paracelsus and Van Helmont. In the early part of his career, he was deeply interested in the study of astrology, and he fancied that the planets somehow exerted an influence on the health of human beings. He at first thought that this influence was electrical, but afterwards referred it to magnetism. At that time his cures were effected by stroking the diseased bodies with artificial magnets. He achieved considerable success by such means, and published a work in 1766 entitled De Planetarum Influxa. In 1776, however, he met Gassner, a Catholic priest who had achieved great notoriety by curing disease by manipulation without the use of any other means. Mesmer then threw away his magnets and evolved the theory of animal magnetism. This he held to be a fluid which pervades the universe, but is most active in the human nervous organization and enables one man, charged with the fluid, to exert a powerful influence over another. 2 years after meeting Gassner, he went to Paris, and at once threw that capital into the wildest excitement by the marvelous effects of his manipulations. He was treated with contumely by the medical profession, but the people flocked to him, and many wonderful cures were effected. His methods, in the light of present knowledge, smack of charlatanism, but that he believed in himself was demonstrated by his earnest demand for an investigation. This the government consented to, and a commission, composed of physicians and members of the Academy of Sciences, was appointed, of which Benjamin Franklin was a member. The report admitted the leading facts claimed by Mesmer, but held that there was no evidence to prove the correctness of his magnetic fluid theory, and referred the wonderful effects witnessed to the imagination of the patients. Their conclusion was that the subject was not worthy of further scientific investigation. It is difficult at this day to conceive by what process of reasoning that learned body could arrive at such a conclusion. They admitted the existence of a motive force capable of controlling man's physical organization, that this force is amenable to control by man, and that this control is capable of being reduced to an art. Then they proceed to announce a discovery of their own, a discovery, by the way, which turns out to be the most important which modern science had, at that time, contributed to the solution of the great problem. They discovered that the phenomena were purely subjective, thereby demonstrating the power of mind over matter. If they had stopped there, or if they had concluded that this wonderful force was worthy of the most searching scientific investigation, they would have been entitled to the gratitude of all mankind, and the science would have been at once wrested from the hands of ignorance and empiricism. That they should content themselves with disproving Mesmer's theory of causation, and, after having themselves made a discovery of the true cause, should announce that their own discovery was not worth the trouble of further investigation is inexplicable. Soon after this, Mesmer was driven into exile, followed by the execrations of a majority of the medical profession, and died in 1815. He left many disciples, a majority of whom were shallow empirics, and mesmerism was brought still further into disrepute. There were a few able and scientific men, however, who still pursued the investigation, among whom were the Marquis de Puyséquerre, Deleuze, and others. These gentlemen revolutionized the art by first causing their subjects to sleep by means of gentle manipulation, instead of surrounding them with mysticism in dimly lighted apartments filled with sweet odors and the strains of soft and mysterious music, as was the practice of Mesmer. They developed in their subjects the power of clairvoyance and demonstrated it in 1,000 ways. They caused them to obey mental orders as readily as if the orders were spoken. They healed the sick, caused the lame to walk, and the blind to see. In short, they so far revived the interest in the subject that the Royal Academy of Medicine in France felt compelled to order a new investigation. This was done in 1825. A committee was appointed, composed of the ablest and most cautious scientists in their body. For nearly 6 years that committee pursued its investigations, and in 1831 it submitted its report. It would be tedious to enumerate all the conclusions at which it arrived. Its principal efforts were directed to the determination of the therapeutic value of mesmerism. It confirmed much that had been claimed for it in that respect, and demonstrated the power of clairvoyance by indubitable tests. It also confirmed the claim that persons could be magnetized at a distance as well as by contact, although there is nothing in the report which shows how far the possibilities of suggestion were removed in that class of experiments. Indeed, in deference to truth, it must be here remarked that mesmerists at that time had but a faint and undefined notion of the subtle role which suggestion plays in all psychological phenomena. Hence it follows that in examining the record of experiments in the higher phenomena of hypnotism, we must make due allowance for possible error in all cases where the nature of the experiments does not preclude the possibility of suggestion having influenced the result, or where the possibilities of suggestion have not been intelligently eliminated. The effect of this report was instantaneous and remarkable. The advocates of magnetism as a therapeutic agent and the believers in the occult features of the phenomena, such as clairvoyance and thought transference, had scored a triumph. But it served only to exasperate the average scientist and to intensify his prejudices. The Academy refused to dignify the report by printing it, and it rests today in silent oblivion in the manuscript archives of the institution. Another committee was soon after appointed, headed by a member who had openly sworn hostility to the doctrine. The result was what might have been expected. After the examination of 2 subjects under circumstances which, in the light of what is now known, rendered failure inevitable, the committee made a very undignified report, announcing the failure to produce the occult phenomena promised, and impugning the intelligence of the former committee. Strange and illogical as it may seem, the later report, which proved nothing, which was confined to an announcement of merely negative results, which simply showed that the committee did not witness certain promised phenomena, was accepted by the average scientist as containing the gospel of hypnotism, as against the report of the earlier committee, which, after 5 years of laborious research, announced that it had witnessed the phenomena in question and demonstrated their reality. For some years subsequent to this, the investigation of the subject was confined to its psychological and therapeutic features, but every scientist who dabbled in it was tabooed by the majority of his associates. Many able works were produced on the subject, but none of them attracted the attention of the academicians until Dr. Braid, of Manchester, undertook to demonstrate the theory that the hypothetical magnetic fluid had nothing to do with the production of the phenomena. Braid discovered that by placing a bright object before the eyes of the subject and causing him to gaze upon it with persistent attention, he could be thrown into the hypnotic sleep, during which many of the well-known phenomena ascribed to magnetism could be produced. This seemed to point to the possibility of a physiological explanation of the subject matter. It attracted the attention of the scientists, and thus to Braid belongs the credit of causing the subject to be at last acknowledged as being within the domain of the exact sciences. The academicians were now mollified. The pet theory of the mesmerists appeared to have been demolished. The method was simple and easily applied. The phenomena of thought transference could not be produced by its methods. It promised a physiological explanation, and, best of all, it had been given a new name. It had received many names before Braid undertook the task of rechristening it, but, with the exception of mesmerism, each was objectionable, because it implied a theory of causation. The name mesmerism was obviously improper, because Mesmer was neither the discoverer of the farce nor the inventor of the practical method of evoking it. Animal magnetism implied Mesmer's theory of magnetic currents. Mental or animal electricity implied practically the same theory. Neurology indicated the science of the nervous system. Pathism, from the Greek radical signifying disease or suffering, and etherology, which means the science of the refined part of the atmosphere, were equally meaningless as applied to the subject. Psychodynamy signified the power of the soul, and electrobiology was American and not to be tolerated. But when Braid denominated it hypnotism, from the Greek word signifying sleep, it was hailed as a compromise sufficiently non-committal to entitle it to recognition and hypnotism. It will be called until some academician drags to light the ultimate cause of all things. Braid has been accorded a great deal of credit for his original researches and discoveries, but it is questionable whether he has not been the indirect means of retarding the true progress of the science. It is a remarkable fact that since his method of hypnotizing has been generally adopted, the higher phenomena, such as clairvoyance and thought transference, have fallen into disrepute and are now rarely produced. Indeed, it may be said to be practically a lost art, considered as a result of hypnotic processes. The cause of this will receive attention hereafter. Braid could not cause his subjects to obey his mental orders, and he disbelieved in the power of clairvoyance. He acknowledged that some of his subjects could tell the shape of what was held at 1.5 inches from the skin, on the back of the neck, crown of the head, arm, or hand, or other parts of the body, but held that it is from feeling they do so. He demonstrated the extreme sensitiveness of one subject by causing her to obey the motion of a glass funnel held in his hand, at a distance of 15 feet. Truly, a remarkable case of feeling. Braid is entitled to great credit for the discovery that the hypnotic state can be induced independently of the presence or cooperation of another person. Further than that, his work is practically valueless, for the reason that he never understood the power or influence of suggestion. It is therefore manifestly impossible to determine the value of any experiment of his, except in cases the nature of which precludes the possibility of suggestion being employed, or in cases where it was expressly eliminated. Two facts, however, seem to have been demonstrated by his experiments, both of which are of the utmost importance. 1. That the hypnotic sleep can be induced independently of personal contact with, or the personal influence of, another. 2. That the sleep can be induced by his method without the aid of suggestion. The mistake which his followers have made is in jumping to the conclusion that because one of the primary conditions of hypnotic phenomena can be induced without the aid of the magnetic hypothesis, therefore the magnetic hypothesis is necessarily incorrect. The same logic would induce a man who for the first time sees a railroad train in motion to conclude that any other method of locomotion is impracticable. Braid himself was not so illogical, for he expressly says that he does not consider the methods identical, but does consider the condition of the nervous system induced by both modes to be analogous. Another mistake, shared in common by both the modern schools of hypnotists, is the failure to appreciate the significance of the fact that by Braid's method the hypnotic condition can be induced without the aid of suggestion. One school ignores the fact altogether, or considers it of doubtful verity, and the other regards it merely as an evidence that suggestion plays a secondary role in hypnotic phenomena. That both are to some extent wrong will appear at the proper time, as will also the fact of the failure of all the schools to grasp its real significance. For some years after the appearance of Braid's book there was but little, if any, progress made in the science. His methods, however, were generally adopted, but the value of his discovery was not appreciated by his own countrymen, and it was not until the continental scientists extended his researches that he obtained substantial recognition. Liebald was the first to confirm his experiments, and in 1866 he published a work in which he advanced much that was new in fact and theory. He was, in fact, the founder of what is now known as the Nancy School of Hypnotism. Many prominent scientists have followed him, and many able works have been produced, prominent among which may be mentioned Suggestive Therapeutics by Professor Bernheim and Hypnotism by Albert Moll of Berlin. Professor Charcot of the Paris Salpêtrière is also the founder of a school of hypnotism, which is generally known as the Paris School or School of the Salpêtrière. Charcot's great reputation as a scientist obtained for him many followers at first, prominent among whom are Binet and F.R.D., whose joint work, entitled Animal Magnetism, has been widely read both in Europe and America. These schools differ widely both in theory and practice, their only point of union being their utter contempt for the theory and practice of what must still be known, for want of a better term, as the Mesmeric School. These three schools represent the grand divisions which it will be necessary to recognize in the discussion of the subject under consideration. The leading points of difference between the three schools may be briefly stated as follows. 1. The theory of the Nancy School is that the different physiological conditions characterizing the hypnotic state are determined by mental action alone. That the phenomena can best be produced in persons of sound physical health and perfect mental balance, and that this mental action and the consequent physical and psychological phenomena are the result, in all cases, of some form of suggestion. 2. The Paris School holds that hypnotism is the result of an abnormal or diseased condition of the nerves, that a great number of the phenomena can be produced independently of suggestion in any form, that the true hypnotic condition can be produced only in persons whose nerves are diseased, and that the whole subject is explicable on the basis of cerebral anatomy or physiology. 3. The mesmerists hold to the fluidic theory of Mesmer, that the hypnotic condition is induced, independent of suggestion, by passes made by the operator over the subject. accompanied by intense concentration of mind and will on the part of the former, that from him flows a subtle fluid which impinges upon the subject wherever it is directed, and produces therapeutic or other effects in obedience to the will of the operator, that these effects can best be produced by personal contact, but that they can be produced at a distance and without the knowledge of the subject, and independently of suggestion. In discussing the merits of these several schools, it is perhaps superfluous to say that it is self-evident that neither school can be entirely right. Each presents an array of facts which seems to support its theory, but as the theories are irreconcilable, and the facts apparently contradict each other, it follows that some fundamental principle underlying the whole subject matter has been overlooked. It is the purpose of this book to suggest a possible way to the discovery of the principle, the missing link which will unite the chain and bind the facts of psychological science into one harmonious whole. The Nancy School of Hypnotism is entitled to the credit of having made the most important discovery in psychological science. The fact that the subjective mind is constantly amenable to control by the power of suggestion constitutes the grand principle in psychological science, which, when properly appreciated and applied, will solve every problem and illuminate every obscurity in the labyrinthian science of the human soul, so far as it will ever be possible for finite intelligence to penetrate it. It is safe to say that in all the broad realm of psychological science there is not a phenomenon upon which it will not shed light. It is no discredit to that school to say that its leaders and teachers do not yet seem to comprehend the profound significance of their discovery, and that in one direction they have extended it to FLRR. It is the latter proposition which will first receive attention. They hold, very correctly, that all the phenomena of hypnotism, subsequent to the induction of the hypnotic condition, are due to the power of suggestion in some form. That this is true admits of no possible doubt. They also find by experiment that the hypnotic condition can be induced simply by the power of suggestion. Their conclusion is that suggestion is a necessary factor in the induction of the hypnotic condition. That this is not true can be very readily demonstrated by reference to a few well-known and admitted facts. One of the first discoveries made by Braid was that by his methods the hypnotic condition could be induced in persons who had never seen or heard of hypnotic phenomena. The following passage from that learned author seems to have been overlooked by those of his commentators who seek for evidence in his experiments to prove that suggestion is a necessary factor in the induction of the hypnotic condition. In order to prove my position still more clearly, I called up one of my men servants, who knew nothing of mesmerism, and gave him such directions as were calculated to impress his mind with the idea that his fixed attention was merely for the purpose of watching a chemical experiment in the preparation of some medicine, and being familiar with such, he could feel no alarm. In 2 minutes and a half his eyelids closed slowly with a vibrating motion, his chin fell on his breast, he gave a deep sigh, and instantly was in a profound sleep, breathing loudly. In about 1 minute after his profound sleep I aroused him, and pretended to chide him for being so careless, said he ought to be ashamed of himself for not being able to attend to my instructions for 3 minutes without falling asleep, and ordered him downstairs. In a short time I recalled this young man, and desired him to sit down once more, but to be careful not to go to sleep again, as on the former occasion. He sat down with this intention, but at the expiration of 2 minutes and a half his eyelids closed, and exactly the same phenomena as in the former experiment ensued. Now, whilst it is true that Braid did not realize the supreme potency of suggestion as it is now understood by the Nancy School, he did intelligently eliminate it in the experiment above related. It was his purpose to demonstrate his theory that the phenomena of mesmerism were to be accounted for on the principle of a derangement of the state of the cerebral spinal centers, and of the circulatory and respiratory and muscular systems. Carried in other words, he was seeking to demonstrate his theory that the phenomena of mesmerism are attributable to a physical rather than a mental cause. Hence his care to select a subject who knew nothing of what was expected of him. Braid relates another circumstance equally demonstrative of the proposition that suggestion is not a necessary factor in the induction of the hypnotic state. He says, after my lecture at the Hanover Square Rooms, London, on the 1st of March 1842, a gentleman told Mr. Walker, who was along with me, that he was most anxious to see me, that I might try whether I could hypnotize him. He said both himself and friends were anxious he should be affected, but that neither LaFontaine nor others who had tried him could succeed. Mr. Walker said, "If that is what you want, as Mr. Braid is engaged otherwise, sit down, and I will hypnotize you myself in a minute." When I went into the room, I observed what was going on, the gentleman sitting staring at Mr. Walker's finger, who was standing a little to the right of the patty carrot tea, with his eyes fixed steadily on those of the latter. I passed on and attended to something else, and when I returned a little after, I found Mr. Walker standing in the same position, asleep, his arm and finger in a state of cataleptiform rigidity, and the patient wide awake and staring at the finger all the while. This is a clear case of the induction of the hypnotic condition without the aid of suggestion. Mr. Walker had no thought of going into the state himself, but was intent on hypnotizing the patient. The suggestion in his mind was, therefore, in the opposite direction. He had, however, inadvertently placed himself in the proper attitude and so concentrated his gaze as to induce the state, and that directly contrary to his autosuggestion. These two instances have been cited from Braid for the reason that one, he was the discoverer of the method of hypnotizing by causing the subject to gaze steadily upon an object, and two, he was not attempting to prove or disprove the theory of suggestion. His testimony is obviously all the more reliable for that reason, for one is prone to distrust the verity of experiments made for the purpose of sustaining a theory. Many facts have been recorded which demonstrate the proposition that by Braid's method the hypnotic state can be induced independently of suggestion. One class only of such facts needs to be cited to convince the most skeptical. I allude to religious devotees, who were often thrown into the hypnotic state, even to the degree of ecstasy, by gazing upon the crucifix or upon pictures of the Holy Virgin or the saints. The Catholic clergy would seem to have a dim perception of the principle involved when they elevate the cross above the eyes of those in whom they wish to excite devotional enthusiasm. Be that as it may, the fact is of scientific value to the investigator of psychological phenomena. The natural attitude of prayer, the eyes raised towards heaven, is certainly not only conducive to devotional feeling, but, in emotional natures, to a state at least cognate to hypnotism, if not identical with it. Hence the subjective hallucinations which often result from the long and earnest prayers of religious enthusiasts. More conclusive still is the fact that animals can be hypnotized. Albert Moll, who is one of the ablest, and certainly one of the most unprejudiced, of modern scientific writers on the subject of hypnotism, writing from the standpoint of the Nancy School, makes the following observations on the subject of hypnotizing animals. States resembling, or perhaps identical with, hypnosis are also found in animals and can easily be experimentally induced. The first experiments of this kind are referred to by the Jesuit Kircher, the so-called Experimentum Seven Mirabile Kircheri. Kircher described these experiments in 1646, but according to Prayer, the experiment had been made by Schwenter several years earlier. The most striking of these experiments, which are being continued in the present day, is as follows. A hen is held down on the ground. The head in particular is pressed down. A chalk line is then drawn on the ground, starting from the bird's beak. The hen will remain motionless. Kircher ascribes this to the animal's imagination. He said that it imagined that it was fastened, and consequently did not try to move. Chermak repeated the experiment on different animals, and announced in 1872 that a hypnotic state could be induced in other animals besides the hen. Prayer shortly after began to interest himself in the question, and made a series of experiments like Chermak's. Prayer, however, distinguishes two states in animals, catalepsy, which is the effect of fear, and the hypnotic state. Hubel, Kitchett, Danilewski, and Rieger, besides the authors mentioned above, have occupied themselves with the question. Most of the experiments have been made with frogs, crayfish, guinea pigs, and birds. I have made many with frogs. This much is certain. Many animals will remain motionless in any position in which they have been held by force for a time. There are various opinions as to the meaning of this. Prayer thinks many of these states are paralyses from fright or catalepsy produced by a sudden peripheral stimulus. In any case, they vividly recall the catalepsy of the Salpêtrière, also caused by a strong external stimulus. The experiments of Kircher, above mentioned, were undertaken with a view of demonstrating his theory that animals possessed great powers of imagination. The chalk mark, he held, represented to the imagination of the hen a string with which she supposed herself to be bound. In his day, of course, nothing was known of hypnotism. It has since been demonstrated that the chalk mark has nothing to do with the production of the phenomenon. The same result follows when the chalk mark is omitted. The writer has hypnotized a pet rooster by Braid's method without using any violence whatever, or even touching the fowl. He was exceedingly tame, and it was only necessary to hold a small object directly before his eyes. When his attention was attracted, he would gaze steadily upon it, and in a very few minutes would go fast asleep. This could not have been a catalepsy caused by fright, nor could it have been the result of a belief in his inability to move, nor a peripheral stimulus caused by friction against the skin, nor could it have been suggestion. In fact, there is no legitimate conclusion apparent except that it was a true hypnosis, identical with that produced on human beings by Braid's methods. This branch of the subject has been dwelt upon somewhat at length, not merely for the purpose of showing that the adherents of the Nancy School carry the doctrine of suggestion too far, but because it is an important point in the study of the subject, and throws a flood of light upon many important and perplexing problems, as will be seen hereafter. The principle to be borne in mind is this: hypnosis can be produced by Braid's method either with or without the aid of suggestion. This does not militate in the slightest degree against the doctrine of suggestion when its powers and limitations are properly understood. It still remains true that all hypnotic phenomena subsequent to the induction of the condition are the result of suggestion in some form. This is the grand discovery of the Nancy School, and when it is once appreciated and understood, it will be found to constitute the master key which will unlock the secrets of every psychological mystery. That it is unqualifiedly true no longer admits of serious doubt. It is acknowledged by nearly every scientist in the civilized world who has given the subject intelligent attention. It is true that the great name of Charcot has commanded a following, but however valuable may have been his observations in the infancy of the science, it has become obvious to most of his former followers that his fundamental hypothesis is defective, and that his conclusions are therefore necessarily unreliable. The discussion of the merits of the Paris School will be brief, and will be chiefly confined to a statement of the reasons for considering its experiments and conclusions unreliable, and to pointing out a few of the more obvious sources of its errors. The first source of error lies in the fact that the experiments of this school are made almost exclusively upon hysterical women. The assumption is that hypnotism is a nervous disease, and that the disease is found in its most pronounced form in hysterical subjects. That this proposition is unqualifiedly wrong is positively known to every student of hypnotism outside the Paris School, and needs no further refutation than the bare statement that the experience of all other schools goes to demonstrate the fact that the best hypnotic subjects are perfectly healthy persons. Another source of error lies in the fact that they ignore suggestion as a necessary factor in the production of hypnotic phenomena. Of course, they are aware of the potency of suggestion when purposely and intelligently employed, but they hold that very many of the most important of the phenomena can be produced without its aid. These, however, are principally physical effects, such as causing any muscle of the body to contract by pressing upon the corresponding nerve, and then releasing the tension by exciting the antagonistic muscle. The condition necessary for the production of this phenomenon is called by Charcot neuromuscular hyperexcitability. In the able and interesting work by Binet and F.R. pupils of Charcot, a chapter is devoted to this branch of the subject. They record, with a scientific exactitude that is very edifying, many curious results in the way of causing contracture of various muscles by kneading, pressure, percussion, etc., releasing the tension by exciting the opposing muscles, and transferring the contractures from one muscle to another by the magnet. Then, with an ingenuousness that is truly charming, they add, as a singular fact, that contractures can be easily produced in many hysterical patients in their waking state, either by kneading the muscles, by pressure on the nerves, or by striking the tendons. These contractures in the waking state are, indeed, of the same nature as those which occur during lethargy, since they yield to the excitement of the antagonistic muscles and may be transferred by the magnet. After this admission, it seems superfluous to remark that this class of experiments prove nothing more than that the state of neuromuscular hyperexcitability is a pathological symptom common to hysterical patients, whether in the waking state or in hypnotic lethargy. They certainly prove nothing which can be construed as characteristic of hypnotism, and the Nancy School wastes its time in demonstrating that the symptoms cannot be reproduced in healthy persons except by the aid of suggestion. Another serious error into which the Charcot School has fallen in its effort to eliminate the effects of suggestion consists in the assumption that subjects in the lethargic state know nothing of what is passing around them, either objectively or subjectively. No greater mistake is possible. The subjective 7-9 never sleeps. No matter how profound the lethargy, it is ever alert and comprehends instantly, with preternatural acuteness, everything that occurs. Professor Bernheim, in the preface to Suggestive Therapeutics, makes the same assertion. He says, "One should first be aware of the fact that in all degrees of hypnosis the subject hears and understands everything, even though he may appear inert and passive. Sometimes the senses are particularly sharp in this state of special concentration, as if all the nervous activity were accumulated in the organ of which the attention is solicited. The state of lethargy is that in which Charcot supposes his subjects to be incapable of receiving a suggestion. Acting upon that hypothesis, it is not astonishing that he should deceive himself as well as the students and spectators attending his clinic. He believes that they hear nothing when they hear everything. It is easy to see how every suggested phenomenon is promptly produced under such conditions. But there is one phenomenon of which the learned professor fails to note the significance, and that is, that, no matter how profound the lethargy, his subject promptly awakens at the word of command. The simple truth regarding the experiments of the Paris School is in a nutshell. Its fundamental error lies in the assumption that hypnosis has a purely physical origin, and that the phenomena are explicable on physiological principles. The phenomena which can be produced independently of suggestion are purely physical, and depend upon the physical condition of neuromuscular hyperexcitability. That this is true is shown by the fact that the physical phenomena produced by Charcot upon his hysterical patients cannot be produced on healthy subjects without the aid of suggestion. But such experiments do not properly belong to the domain of psychic science proper, but rather to the Bradian system of physical manipulation. This is as much as confessed by Binet and F. Carrotry, when they divulge the fact that the physical phenomena in question can be produced on hysterical patients in their waking condition. Another prolific source of error which besets the pathway of the Paris School consists in its disbelief in, and consequent disregard of, the possibility that its subjects may be possessed of clairvoyant or telepathic powers. That this frequently happens, especially in subjects of the character employed by Charcot and his coadjutors, admits of no possible doubt in the minds of those who have studied the higher phases of hypnotic science. The London Society for Psychical Research has demonstrated beyond all question the fact that telepathy is a power possessed by many. And the early mesmerists have shown conclusively that the hypnotic condition is the one of all others the most favorable for the development and exhibition of that power. This subject will be dwelt upon more at length in its proper place. It is sufficient for present purposes to remark that no line of experiments in hypnotism, in which telepathy and clairvoyance are ignored as possible factors, can be held to be demonstrative of any proposition or theory whatever. But whatever of pathological value or interest may be attached to the physical phenomena evoked by the Paris School, they certainly shed no light upon psychological science, nor do they properly belong to that domain. And just here I wish to suggest a reform in the nomenclature of the science under consideration. The word hypnotism was adopted by Braid at a time when he regarded himself as the discoverer of a principle which embraced the whole science of induced sleep. It is from the Greek word hypnos, which broadly signifies sleep. But, without some qualifying word, it is too broad, inasmuch as the system to which Braid applied it is now known to be but one of many processes of inducing sleep. He imagined that he had discovered a full explanation of all psychic phenomena of the class then known as mesmeric, whereas he had only discovered the one fact that the sleep could be induced by producing an abnormal physical condition of certain nerve centers. It was a very important discovery, for psychic science would be incomplete without it, but it does not constitute the whole science. It does, however, explain many phenomena otherwise inexplicable, and marks a line of distinction which could not otherwise be drawn. The methods of the Charcot school are essentially Braidian, and hence its results are limited largely to physical phenomena, and its conclusions necessarily pertain to physical science. The Nancy school, on the other hand, produces all its phenomena by oral suggestion and ignores the fact that the sleep can be induced in the absence of any form of suggestion. It repudiates Braid's method of inducing it as unnecessary and also as injurious, in that the physical disturbance of the nerve centers unduly excites the patient. The mesmeric school differs from both the others in methods and theory, as we shall see further on. It seems necessary, therefore, that the terminology of the science should be changed so as clearly to define the theoretical differences of the three schools. It is obvious, however, that the terminology cannot be based on results, for they are inextricably intermingled. Thus, the Braidian or Charcot operator might accidentally produce psychic phenomena identical with that produced by the mesmerists and vice versa. And so might the suggestive school. Indeed, the writings of both schools occasionally betray the fact that they sometimes catch glimpses of something in their patients which defies chemical analysis and cannot be carved with the scalpel. The terminology must, therefore, refer to the methods of inducing the subjective state. If the word hypnotism is to be retained because it embraces all degrees of induced sleep by whatsoever process it may have been induced, it would seem proper to designate the Braidian process as physical hypnotism, the Nancy process as suggestive hypnotism, and the mesmeric process as magphytic or fluidic hypnotism. I merely throw this out as a suggestion to be considered by future writers on the subject. For my own purposes, I shall hereafter employ the word hypnotism to define the Braidian and suggestive processes as distinguished from all others when these are contrasted, while the word mesmerism will be employed as it is generally understood. When they are not contrasted, hypnotism will be used as a generic term. Last in the order of mention, but really first in importance, is the school of mesmerism. The theory of the mesmerists has undergone little, if any, modification since it was first promulgated by Mesmer himself. It is, as before stated, that there exists in man a subtle fluid, in the nature of magnetism, which, by means of passes over the head and body of the subject, accompanied by intense concentration of mind and will on the part of the operator, can be made to flow from the ends of his fingers and impinge upon the subject, producing sleep and all the varied subsequent phenomena at the will of the operator. In the early days of mesmerism, suggestion was ignored as a possible factor in the production of the phenomena, this law not having been discovered previous to the experiments of Liebold. The same is practically true today. Mesmerism has made very little progress within the last half-century. Its votaries cling to the old theories with a pertinacity proportioned to the opposition encountered at the hands of the hypnotists. On the whole, the progress of mesmeric science, per se, has been backward since the discoveries of Braid, not because Braid disproved the fluidic theory, for he did not disprove it, nor did he claim to have done so, but for reasons which will appear in their proper place. Suggestion is now, as before the discoveries of Liebold, ignored by mesmerists as a necessary factor either in the induction of the mesmeric condition or in the production of the subsequent phenomena. In this they are partly right and partly wrong. Suggestion, in the ordinary acceptation of the term, that is, oral suggestion, is not an indispensable factor in the induction of the condition. This is shown in a great variety of ways. One fact alone demonstrates the principle, and that is, that subjects who have been often mesmerized by a particular individual can be by him thrown into that state, under certain favorable conditions, even though the two may be many miles apart. Account is not taken in this of the many experiments of the old mesmerists, who previously informed their subjects of the intended experiment. But many instances might be cited where this has been accomplished under test conditions, the element of suggestion being carefully eliminated. The writer has mesmerized a subject at a distance of 300 miles, and that under conditions which rendered oral or objective suggestion impossible. Particular instances will not be cited here, for the reason that in subsequent chapters of this book the principle involved will be rendered so plain that further proofs would be superfluous. A further demonstration of this principle lies in the fact that children, too young to understand what is expected of them, and animals of various kinds, can be mesmerized. This is abundantly proved by the experiments of Wilson, who, as early as 1839, mesmerized elephants, horses, wolves, and other animals in London. Obersteimer states that in Austria, the law requires army horses to be mesmerized for the purpose of shoeing them. This process was introduced by a cavalry officer named Balassa, and hence it has been termed and is now known as the Balasiren of horses Mall. This is the secret of the celebrated horse tamers, Sullivan and Rari. By their methods, the wildest colts and the most vicious horses could be subdued in an hour. Mesmerism is the power exerted by the lion tamer and the snake charmer. The power is often exerted unconsciously, that is, without a knowledge on the part of the operator of the source of his power. The mesmerists of the present day are not, of course, ignorant or unmindful of the potency of suggestion in the production of mesmeric phenomena subsequent to the induction of the condition. But, like the Paris school of hypnotists, they hold that suggestion plays a secondary role in the production of many of the phenomena. That they are wrong in this will more fully appear in subsequent chapters of this book. The points of difference between the three schools of this science have now been reviewed, and the theories of each briefly stated. It is found, 1. That the Nancy school attributes all the phenomena, including the induction of the state, to the power of suggestion, and that it is to the psychic powers and attributes of man alone that we must look for an explanation. 2. The Paris school, on the other hand, ignores suggestion as a necessary factor either in the induction of the state or in the production of subsequent phenomena, and seeks an explanation of the subject matter on the basis of physiology and cerebral anatomy. 3. The mesmerists ignore suggestion as a necessary factor at any stage of their experiments, and explain the whole on the magnetic fluid theory. We also find three distinct methods of inducing the sleep, and as it is of the utmost importance to bear the different methods in mind, they will be here restated. The Nancy school, true to its theory, employs suggestion alone to induce the condition. Passes are sometimes made over its subjects after the manner of the mesmerists, but only with a view of giving an air of mystery to the proceedings, and thus adding potency to the suggestion. The Paris school employs physical means to induce the state almost exclusively. They are practically the same as those employed by Braid, namely, causing the subject to gaze steadily at a bright object, although many variations of the method have been introduced, such as flashing an electric light in the eyes of the subject, striking a gong without warning close to his ears, or by some peripheral excitation, such as rubbing the scalp, etc. The mesmeric method proper consists in making passes from the head downwards, gazing fixedly into the subject's eyes, and concentrating the mind upon the work in hand, strongly willing the subject to sleep. It is true that many of the so-called mesmerists now employ Braid's method entirely, and others depend largely upon suggestion. But the true mesmeric method is as has been stated.